It was January 1991. Baghdad was not just a city, it was a fortress. To the pilots of the coalition forces waiting nervously on runways in Saudi Arabia and on carrier decks in the Persian Gulf, the Iraqi capital was known by a simpler, darker name. They called it downtown, and going downtown was considered a suicide mission. In the strategy rooms of the Pentagon, the analysts were not looking at a city. They were looking at a meat grinder. The airspace over Baghdad was the most heavily defended patch of sky in the history of warfare. It was denser than Hanoi during the Vietnam War. It was denser than Berlin during World War II. It was a kill box meticulously engineered to bleed any air force that dared to enter it. At the heart of this fortress sat Saddam Hussein, and more importantly, his military advisors. Many of them were trained in Moscow. They were confident. In fact, they were arrogant. They believed they had built an impenetrable shield, a dome of steel, that no American aircraft could penetrate without being swatted from the sky like a fly. They had reasons for this confidence. They had spent billions of dollars, much of it paid to the Soviet Union and France, to construct an integrated air defense system known as Kari. Kari was a masterpiece of brute force. It was a network that tied together over 16,000 surface-to-air missiles and more than 3,000 anti-aircraft guns. It was a layered system designed according to the classic Soviet doctrine of overlapping fields of fire. If you flew high, you were in the domain of the SA-2 and SA-3 missiles, the telephone pole-sized killers that had shot down U-2 spy planes and F-4 Phantoms for decades. If you flew lower to avoid the big radars, you entered the envelope of the SA-6 and the terrified Roland Systems agile missiles that could snap a jet in half. And if you flew on the deck, skimming the rooftops to hide in the ground, clutter, you would be shredded by thousands of ZSU-23-4 Shilka anti-aircraft guns, spewing walls of lead into the sky. Every inch of the sky was covered. Every altitude was a death trap. The nerve center of this system was a hardened bunker deep beneath Baghdad. Here, Iraqi commanders watched giant screens that displayed the entire airspace of the country. The Kari system, designed by French contractors but operated on Soviet principles, was a computerized brain. It took data from hundreds of early warning radars scattered across the desert and fused it into a single coherent picture. The moment an American jet crossed the border, Kari would see it. It would track it. It would automatically assign the nearest missile battery to kill it. It was a system designed to handle mass. The Iraqis expected the Americans to attack the way they always had, with waves of fighters jamming pods, screaming, trying to brute force their way through the wall. And for that kind of war, Baghdad was ready. But the confidence of the Iraqi generals went deeper than just their hardware. It was rooted in a fundamental belief about the laws of physics. For decades, the Soviet Union had taught its client states a simple truth. There is no such thing as invisibility. Soviet radar theory was advanced. Their physicists were brilliant. They knew that any object moving through the air, a bird, a cloud, and certainly a 20-ton metal aircraft would reflect radar waves. It was a law of nature. You could try to hide it with electronic jamming. You could try to fly low, but you could not disappear. So when rumors began to circulate in the late 1980s about a secret American stealth plane, the Soviet military establishment dismissed it. They laughed at it much like they had laughed at the M1 Abrams tank. Propaganda. A Soviet general might have said sipping tea in a Baghdad advisor's villa. Hollywood magic. A plane cannot be invisible to radar. It is physically impossible. If it is made of metal, we will see it. If it has an engine, we will hear it. If it flies, we can kill it. They believed the Americans were bluffing. They believed stealth was a psychological operation designed to scare them. They looked at their massive P-14 Tall King radars capable of detecting a target hundreds of miles away, and they felt safe. They trusted in the power of their transmitters. They trusted in the sensitivity of their receivers. They trusted in the sheer overwhelming volume of their missiles. This arrogance was their fatal mistake. They were preparing for a boxing match, a slugfest, where they would trade blows with the U.S. Air Force. They were prepared to take losses knowing that for every missile they fired, they would extract a blood price from the Americans. They did not know that the Americans had no intention of boxing. The Americans were planning an assassination. In the Pentagon, General Norman Schwarzkopf and his air commanders knew exactly what Kari was. They respected it. They feared it. They knew that if they sent conventional F-15s or F-16s into the heart of Baghdad on the first night, the result would be a massacre. The skies would be lit up with burning American wreckage. But they had a problem. The eyes and ears of the Iraqi military, the communications centers, the radar command bunkers, the AT&T building in downtown Baghdad that routed all the military orders were right in the center of the kill zone. To win the war, they had to blind the enemy. They had to cut the head off the snake. And they had to do it in the first hour of the first night. They needed a miracle. They needed a ghost. And in the dark hangars of a secret base in Tonopah, Nevada, that ghost was waiting. It was the most ugly, ungainly, and improbable machine ever built. It looked like a shard of broken obsidian. It had no curves. Its fuselage was a collection of sharp, flat facets welded together at strange, aggressive angles. It had no tail in the traditional sense. Its cockpit windows were coated in gold. It was the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk. To the pilots who flew it, it was known affectionately as the Wobblin' Goblin. To the engineers at Skunk Works who built it, it was the Hopeless Diamond. It was a plane that broke every rule of aerodynamics. It was subsonic. It couldn't turn tight. It couldn't climb fast. It had no afterburners. It carried no radar of its own because turning on a radar would be like lighting a flashlight in a dark room. It would give away its position. It carried no defensive guns. It carried no flares to distract missiles. By every conventional metric of the Cold War, it was a terrible fighter jet. A MiG-21 from the 1960s could fly circles around it. A standard anti-aircraft gun could rip it to shreds if the gunner could see it. But the F-117 was not built to fight. It was built to do one thing and one thing only. It was built to be a hole in the radar screen. The secret of the F-117 was not in its engines or its speed. It was in its shape. Decades earlier, a Russian physicist named Pyotr Ufimtsev had published a dry, obscure academic paper titled Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. In it, he theorized that the radar reflection of an object didn't depend on its size, but on the configuration of its edges. The Soviet government allowed the paper to be published because they deemed it useless. It was just complex math with no practical application. They were wrong. An American analyst at Lockheed found the paper. He translated it. And he realized that Ufimtsev had handed them the key to invisibility. The hopeless diamond shape of the F-117 was designed by a computer program called Echo 1, based on Ufimtsev's equations. The flat facets were not there for style. They were angled precisely to bounce incoming radar waves away from the source. If a radar beam hit the plane instead of reflecting back to the receiver like a normal echo, it would be scattered into the empty sky. To a Soviet radar operator, the F-117 didn't look like a 20-ton jet. It looked like a bird, or a marble, or most of the time it looked like nothing at all. This was the gamble. The United States Air Force was betting the entire opening of the war on a physics equation. They were sending a slow, unarmed, unmaneuverable jet into the most heavily defended city on Earth, armed only with the belief that the enemy would not be able to see it. If the calculations were wrong, the F-117s would be slaughtered. If the Iraqis had a different kind of radar, or if they got a visual lock, the pilots would be dead. There was no plan B for the Nighthawks. Their only defense was invisibility. On the afternoon of January 16, 1991, the sun began to set over the Arabian Peninsula. At the Khamis Mushait Air Base in Saudi Arabia, the black jets were wheeled out of their hardened shelters. The pilots' men who had trained for years in total secrecy climbed into the cockpits. They were known as the Bandits. They wore no unit patches. Their mission briefs were stamped top secret. As they taxied to the runway, the world was holding its breath. The ultimatum to Saddam Hussein was expiring. The greatest air armada since World War II was assembling in the darkness. But the F-117s were going alone. They were the first day of the war package. They would launch hours before the main force. They would fly deep into Iraq, refueling in the dark silence, and cross the border alone. Their target was Baghdad, downtown, the heart of the fortress. Inside the cockpit of Bandit 361, the pilot checked his systems. He armed his payload, 2 GBU-27 Paveway 3 laser-guided bombs, 2,000 pounds of high explosive designed to penetrate reinforced concrete. He looked at his map. His destination was the AT&T building, a communications hub in the center of Baghdad, surrounded by rooftop gun emplacements and missile batteries. He pushed the throttle forward. The F-117, clumsy and awkward on the ground, lifted into the twilight. The pilot knew that in a few hours he would be flying directly over the heads of 16,000 enemy soldiers who wanted to kill him. He knew that the moment he crossed into Iraqi airspace, he would be maintaining total radio silence. He would be utterly alone. He also knew that the Soviet advisors in Baghdad were watching their screens, confident in their impenetrable shield. They were waiting for a fight. They had no idea that the fight had already been decided in a laboratory in California 10 years ago. They were waiting for a roar. They were about to get a whisper. The sun dipped below the horizon. The desert turned black, and the Nighthawks vanished into the void. The invisible invasion had begun. The border was not a line in the sand. To the electronic eyes of the F-117, it was a wall of electromagnetic energy. As the flight of Nighthawks crossed into Iraqi airspace, they were entering the most hostile environment on the planet. They were now inside the super engagement zone of the Kari system. In a conventional war, this was the moment the sky would have erupted. The radar warning receivers in the cockpits should have been screaming with the lock-on tones of SA-2 and SA-3 missiles. The horizon should have been streaked with the smoke trails of interceptors scrambling to meet them. But there was only silence. Inside the cockpit of Bandit 361, the pilot watched his displays. He was flying straight and level at medium altitude. He wasn't hiding in the canyons. He wasn't skimming the deck. He was flying exactly where the Soviet manuals said he shouldn't be. He was flying right down the throat of the enemy defense. He could see the radar threats on his display. The symbols for the P-14 Tall Kings and the Spoon Rest radars were popping up. They were sweeping the sky, pulsing megawatt bursts of energy, searching for him. Every time a radar beam swept over his jet, the pilot held his breath. He was trusting his life to the angles of his fuselage and the coating on his wings. He was trusting that Ben Rich and the wizards at Skunk Works were right. The beam hit the plane. The energy was deflected. The radar screen in the Iraqi bunker remained blank. The pilot exhaled. The ghost was real. For the Iraqi operators sitting in their command centers, the night was confusingly quiet. Their screens showed a clear sky. The moonless night was calm. There were no blips, no intruders. The dome of steel appeared to be intact. They had no idea that 10 American bombers were currently flying through their airspace, some of them passing within lethal range of their missile batteries. The F-117s were not invisible to the naked eye, but in the pitch black of the desert night, without afterburners, they were effectively holes in the sky. As the Nighthawks approached Baghdad, the density of the threats increased. The pilot of Bandit 361 could see the lights of the city sprawling out before him. It was a surreal moment. He was a tourist in hell. The streetlights were on. Cars were driving on the highways. The city was asleep, completely unaware that the executioner was already in the room. The target, the AT&T building, also known as the Telecommunications Center, was the hub of the Kari network. It was a hardened bunker disguised as a civilian structure, crucial for coordinating the missile defenses across the entire country. If Bandit 361 could destroy it, the brain of the Iraqi air defense would suffer a massive stroke. The limbs, the missile batteries in the south and north, would be cut off from the head. The pilot checked his timing. H-hour was set for exactly 03:00 local time. The entire operation was choreographed to the second. The F-117s had to strike first, blinding the enemy to open the door for the hundreds of conventional aircraft that were minutes behind them. At 02:59, the bomb bay doors of Bandit 361 snapped open. This was the most dangerous moment. For a few seconds, the perfect stealth geometry of the F-117 was compromised. The open doors created a radar cavity. If a radar swept him now, he would light up like a Christmas tree. The pilot worked quickly. His thumb danced on the sensor controller. On his infrared display, the AT&T building appeared in ghostly green contrast. He placed the crosshairs on the ventilation shaft in the center of the roof. Ideally, he wanted to thread the needle drop the bomb down the shaft so it would explode deep inside the bunker. Target designated. The computer took over. It calculated the wind, the speed, the altitude. A slight shudder went through the airframe. The 2,000-pound GBU-27 fell away. The bomb bay doors snapped shut. The ghost was sealed again. The bomb, guided by a laser beam invisible to the human eye, glided silently through the darkness. It was a monolith of destruction, correcting its fins as it fell, hunting the laser spot with mathematical precision. Inside the Kari command bunker, the Soviet-trained officers were sipping coffee, watching the news on CNN, waiting for a war they thought would start with a massive, noisy invasion. Above them, the GBU-27 pierced the roof of the telecommunications center. It didn't explode immediately. It had a hardened penetrator casing and a delayed fuse. It smashed through the reinforced concrete floors, plunging deep into the heart of the building. Then it detonated. The explosion didn't blow the building apart. It gutted it. The blast wave, confined by the thick walls, incinerated the server rooms, the communication switches, and the command links. In a fraction of a second, the brain of the Iraqi air defense was vaporized. Outside, the night sky over Baghdad instantly turned into day. Moments later, a second F-117, piloted by the squadron commander, dropped a second bomb on the same building, ensuring that nothing could possibly survive. Simultaneously, all across the city, other F-117s were striking their targets. The Presidential Palace, the Ministry of Defense, the Air Force headquarters. It was a decapitation strike of unprecedented precision. Down on the ground, chaos erupted. The anti-aircraft gunners, woken by the explosions, did exactly what they were trained to do in the Soviet doctrine. They unleashed a curtain of fire. Within seconds, the sky over Baghdad was filled with tracers. Thousands of ZSU-23s and 57mm cannons began firing blindly into the air. It was a spectacular, terrifying display of pyrotechnics. To the CNN cameras watching from the Al Rashid Hotel, it looked like the entire sky was burning. But it was sound and fury signifying nothing. They were shooting at ghosts. The Iraqi gunners were firing at the noise of the explosions, or simply firing straight up in a panic. They had no radar tracks to follow. Their fire control computers were looking at empty sky. The Soviet advisors watched in horror as their magnificent integrated system collapsed into a chaotic, uncoordinated mess. Above the tracers, the F-117 pilots watched the show. They were flying at altitudes that put them just above the reach of the light anti-aircraft guns, and the heavy missiles, the SA-2s and SA-3s, were staying in their launchers. Without radar guidance from the now-destroyed command centers, the heavy missiles were useless. Bandit 361 turned for home. The pilot looked back at the city. It was a cauldron of fire, but he hadn't been touched. No missile launch warnings. no searchlights finding him. He had flown into the heart of the fortress, killed the king, and walked out the front door. But the night wasn't over. As the F-117 slipped away into the darkness, the second phase of the humiliation began. The destruction of the Kari network's central nodes meant that the individual radar sites were now operating in isolation. They were blind to the big picture. They couldn't share data. They were confused, terrified, and uncoordinated. And that was when the main force arrived. Hundreds of conventional aircraft, F-15s, F-16s, F-18s, tornadoes roared across the border. But they weren't alone. They brought with them another American innovation that would drive the final nail into the coffin of the Soviet doctrine, the HARM. The high-speed anti-radiation missile. The Iraqi radar operators, desperate to find the invisible enemies that had just bombed their capital, turned on their radars. They blasted the sky with energy, trying to get a lock on anything. This was exactly what the Americans wanted. The HARM missiles fired from F-4G Wild Weasels and F-18s were designed to hunt radar beams. The moment an Iraqi radar turned on a HARM would lock onto the signal and ride it down to the source at Mach 3. The Iraqi operators were faced with a terrifying choice. If they turned their radars on, they died. If they kept their radars off to survive, they were blind, and the American bombers would destroy them anyway. It was a checkmate. By sunrise on the first day of the war, the impenetrable air defense network of Baghdad was in ruins. The strategic command centers were smoking craters. The radar sites were being picked off one by one. The Iraqi Air Force, the sixth largest in the world, was essentially grounded, its pilots too terrified to fly into a sky they no longer controlled. The F-117 Nighthawk had flown less than 2% of the combat sorties in the opening 24 hours. But it had struck 40% of the strategic targets. It had done the impossible. It had proven that mass was irrelevant. In Moscow, the reports coming in from their advisors in Baghdad were met with stunned silence. The GRU generals, the men who had laughed at the hopeless diamond, were now staring at the death of their entire worldview. They had spent decades building a shield based on the idea that they could see the enemy coming. They had built faster missiles, bigger radars, and more guns. They had assumed that the air war would be a contest of strength. The Americans had changed the rules of the game. They hadn't built a stronger hammer. They had built a needle that could slip between the ribs and puncture the heart before the victim even knew the fight had started. The psychological impact was devastating. The stealth fighter was no longer a rumor or a propaganda piece. It was a terrifying reality. It was a weapon that could not be deterred, could not be tracked, and could not be stopped. For the Soviet Union, already teetering on the brink of economic and political collapse, this was a final, humiliating blow. Their technology, their pride, their exports, the foundations of their military power, had been exposed as obsolete junk in a single night. The F-117 didn't just bomb buildings in Baghdad. It bombed the Kremlin's confidence. As dawn broke over the Saudi desert, the black jets returned to their hangars. The ground crews, waiting anxiously, counted them in. One by one, the bandits landed. Not a single F-117 had been shot down. Not a single one had even been scratched. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits, exhausted, smelling of sweat and jet fuel. They had just flown the most dangerous mission in the history of modern air warfare. They had flown against the best defenses the Soviet Union could export, and they had come back with a score of perfection. But there was one more twist to the story. One final revelation that would underscore just how complete the American dominance was. The F-117 was a first-generation stealth aircraft. It was a clumsy design limited by the computers of the 1970s. It was in many ways a prototype pressed into service. While the F-117 was tearing apart Baghdad, the Americans were already flying something else in the dark. Something far more advanced. Something that made the Nighthawk look like a toy. The B-2 Spirit bomber. The Soviets had been defeated by the opening act. They hadn't even seen the main event. The burning night of Baghdad was not just a victory for the United States. It was a public execution of the Soviet military-industrial complex. The world watched on live television as the fortress crumbled. And the question that haunted every general in Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang was no longer, can we defeat the Americans? It was, can we even see them? The first night was a shock. The rest of the war was a systematic dismantling of a superpower's reputation. For the next 42 nights, the F-117 Nighthawks returned to Baghdad. They came in waves. They struck bridges, bunkers, chemical weapons, plants, and command nodes. They flew with a regularity that was almost insulting. The Iraqi gunners who had started the war with defiance, firing their weapons into the sky with religious fervor, eventually stopped firing. They realized the terrifying truth: if they fired, they revealed their position to the wild weasel aircraft hunting them. And if they didn't fire, the ghosts bombed them anyway. Psychological terror became a weapon as potent as the laser-guided bombs. Iraqi commanders began to abandon their bunkers at night, preferring to sleep in the open desert rather than stay inside the hardened shelters that the F-117s seemed to find with such supernatural ease. The fortress of Baghdad had become a prison. Back in Moscow, the mood in the Ministry of Defense was grim. The Soviet generals were not just watching an ally lose a war. They were watching their own inheritance burn. Every burning T-72 tank, every shattered MiG-29 on the runway, and every silent, destroyed radar site was a billboard advertising the failure of Soviet technology. But nothing hurt more than the success of the F-117. The stealth fighter was the one variable they could not explain away. They tried to spin it. Soviet diplomatic cables suggested that the Iraqis were incompetent, that they were using the equipment wrong, that the export versions of the radars were inferior. But the analysts in the GRU knew better. They knew that the P-14 radars in Iraq were powerful. They knew the Kari system was sound. The problem wasn't the operator. The problem was the physics. The Americans had effectively hacked the electromagnetic spectrum. The final statistics of the F-117's performance in Operation Desert Storm are among the most lopsided in the history of aviation. The Nighthawks flew approximately 1,300 combat sorties. They flew exclusively at night. They flew exclusively against the most heavily defended targets in the theater. The number of F-117s shot down by enemy fire was 0. The number of F-117s damaged by enemy fire was 0. It was a perfect game, a clean sheet. For the Soviet High Command, this statistic was a nightmare. It meant that the billions of rubles they had invested in their own air defense network, the S-300s, the massive over-the-horizon radars, the layered interceptor fleets were potentially worthless against a first-strike stealth attack. The doctrine of mass had collided with the doctrine of invisibility, and invisibility had won. This realization triggered a panic that would ripple through the Russian military-industrial complex for decades. They realized they were not just behind, they were fighting a different war entirely. While Soviet engineers were still trying to squeeze more power out of their radar transmitters, American engineers at Lockheed had rendered the entire concept of radar power irrelevant. It didn't matter how loud you shouted if the person you were looking for didn't have ears, but the humiliation went deeper than just the battlefield. It was a humiliation of engineering capability. When the Soviet intelligence agencies finally gathered enough data on the F-117 to understand how it worked, they found themselves staring at a gap that was not just military, but industrial. To build a machine like the F-117, you needed more than just the equations of Pyotr Ufimtsev. You needed a manufacturing capability that the Soviet Union simply did not possess. The F-117 required tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. If a panel was misaligned by the width of a human hair, the radar cross-section would bloom, and the plane would be visible. The radar-absorbent coatings were toxic, difficult to apply, and required climate-controlled facilities that looked more like operating rooms than factories. The Soviet system, built on quotas, 5-year plans, and good-enough heavy industry, could not produce such a machine. They could build titanium hulls for submarines that could dive to 3,000 feet. They could build rockets that could lift massive payloads. But they could not build the delicate, precision-engineered facets of a stealth fighter. They had the theory. They lacked the ecosystem. The hopeless diamond was in fact the ultimate triumph of the American free market aerospace industry. It was a product of extreme competition, where companies like Lockheed and Northrop were willing to risk their own money and reputation to solve an impossible problem. The legacy of the burning night of Baghdad is still with us today. The success of the F-117 effectively killed the Soviet export market for military hardware for a decade. Who would buy a MiG-29 or an SA-6 missile after seeing them obliterated on CNN? Countries that had traditionally looked to Moscow for protection began to look elsewhere or began to develop their own asymmetric strategies. But for the United States, the F-117 was just the beginning. The Nighthawk was a proof of concept. It was a silver bullet designed for a specific moment in time. It was subsonic, aerodynamic as a brick, and difficult to fly. But it proved that stealth worked. It paved the way for the B-2 Spirit, a flying wing that combined invisibility with massive range and payload. It paved the way for the F-22 Raptor, a fighter that combined stealth with the supersonic maneuverability that the MiG-25 could only dream of. And it led to the F-35 Lightning II, a flying computer that serves as the backbone of NATO today. The Soviet Union never recovered from the shock. The economic strain of trying to compete with American high-tech weapons, combined with the collapse of oil prices and internal political rot, eventually brought the empire down. In a very real sense, the F-117 Nighthawk helped to end the Cold War not by fighting a nuclear apocalypse, but by preventing one. It proved that the West possessed a technological edge so sharp that a conventional war against NATO was unwinnable. The pilot of Bandit 361, flying home on that first morning, watched the sun rise over the Persian Gulf. He was tired. His neck hurt from the tension. But he knew he had made history. He had flown into the dragon's lair. He had walked past the sleeping guards. He had struck the beast in the heart. And he had walked away without a scratch. The era of the fortress was over. The era of the ghost had begun. Years later, in a dusty museum in Serbia, the wreckage of an F-117 shot down in 1999, the only one ever lost in combat, would be displayed. It was shot down by a clever commander who used an old Soviet radar in an unconventional way, proving that no technology is invincible forever. But in 1991, over the skies of Baghdad, the F-117 was invincible. It was the physical embodiment of a new American way of war, precision over brute force, quality over quantity, and most importantly, the ability to strike your enemy while remaining nothing more than a rumor in the dark. The Soviet generals who laughed at the hopeless diamond learned a hard lesson that night. They learned that in the modern age, what you can't see can absolutely kill you. And for the Soviet Union, the writing wasn't on the wall. It was on a radar screen that showed nothing until the bombs began to fall.